Christopher, I just want to ask some questions, bring out areas that perhaps the general readership may not be aware of, but which would be of interest to them. So I guess if we start off with you, your family history is something that is of considerable interest.
Well, I was born in Nebworth, on the estate of Nebworth House, which was where my mother's family lived. They had owned land around there for several hundred years. I guess they were chiefly known as her grandfather was the Viceroy of India, and her father was later Governor of Bengal and acting Viceroy. My father was from a family of what my in-laws rudely call Huddersfield solicitors, but because of work that the family did in the government, he became a peer. Eventually it was his peerage that I inherited.
Just to go back on your mother's side, this was the Lytton family, and of course there's a rich history in literature there as well.
Yes, the Viceroy's father was Bulwer Lytton, who was a great Victorian novelist, and in his day sold even more books than his good friend Charles Dickens. They worked a good deal together on amateur dramatics that they both enjoyed very much. It's fascinating that Dickens has remained extremely popular and famous, and Bulwer Lytton has largely sunk without trace. Having read a few of his books, I can quite understand why, because they are mostly fairly boring. He has a play called Money, which is revived from time to time because it reflects so much of what is going on at the moment. That is an obsession with lots of money, not necessarily your own. Nowadays, that's probably the only thing that he is still remembered for.
And then just perhaps before we leave your family, it might be worth just commenting on your father's wartime history, which was quite interesting.
He was in the SOE and spent the war in the mountains in Greece as a leader of the Greek guerrilla force. They did have one extremely notable success, which was blowing up a bridge called the Gorgopotamus, which was on the only north-south railway line through the middle of Greece, and this interrupted the supplies to the German North African campaign. But he remained in Greece throughout the war. Really, that was the beginning of a great love affair with Greece that lasted all his life, and he spoke Greek fluently.
Let's get on to yourself and talk about your education. Tell us a little bit about that.
I went to school at Winchester and then medical school at Guy's. I graduated in 1970. I'd always wanted to be a surgeon, and the most glamorous surgery when I graduated was renal transplantation. And so my first ever job was as house surgeon in transplantation, and later on SHO in transplantation with Professor Shackman and Jeff Chisholm when they were at the Hammersmith. As transplants were done by urologists in those days, that meant automatically doing urology, and in some way I just gradually transferred my allegiance from transplantation into urology. I was senior registrar at the Institute of Urology. My first appointment was as senior registrar to Sir David Innes-Williams in Pediatric Urology. I really got very hooked on pediatric urology, although I did a full range of urological subspecialties. I always found that pediatric urology was the one I liked best. There used to be a wonderful job at the institute that you could be senior lecturer for 3 years, during which time you were working as a consultant but able to develop your own subspecialty interest. Mine was to develop adolescent urology, that is the care of pediatric patients when they outgrow a pediatric urology unit, and I have followed that ever since. Coincidentally, because adolescent urology wasn't even a subject when I started doing it, I also had a consultancy at the Royal Marsden to do oncology. Rather surprisingly, those two went hand in hand, because the reconstructive techniques that are used in pediatric urology can also be translated to cancer patients, and that meant that I was able to develop reconstructive urology far more than I think I would have been able to do with either subject alone, just simply because of the numbers adding up.
Can I just ask you to draw the distinction between pediatric urology, which most people probably would consider urology up to the age of 16, and adolescent urology? Obviously, I know that this is an area that you have really developed and carries your name.
I think it's even a little more complicated than that, because if you are born or develop in childhood a major illness, you will one day grow up. If your illness has an equivalent in adult life, let's say diabetes, asthma, rheumatoid arthritis, then you do have a problem getting through adolescence, because we all know the way that adolescents behave and the way they reject authority and don't do what they're told or what is good for them. And that requires management in its own right, and getting an adolescent through insulin-dependent diabetes, for example, is very difficult. However, once they have recovered from being an adolescent, they can then be an adult with diabetes and continue in a diabetic clinic. On the other hand, there are plenty of conditions, and certainly all the ones in urology, where there is no adult equivalent. There is no adult equivalent of exstrophy or of posterior urethral valves or of myelomeningocele and other things like that. When children with those problems become adolescents, they require adolescent care, but even when they are adults, they need to be looked after by somebody who understands exstrophy, rather than by a urologist who is going to see one person with exstrophy in their entire career. It's not a question of cleverness, it's a question of exposure to the relevant problems. So I regard adolescent urology as the care of children with the major congenital anomalies from puberty to death.
So let's just find out who these people were who have, over the years and at that time, influenced you into going into adolescent urology.
Inevitably began with pediatric urology, and my first really great and wonderful mentor in urology was John Blandy, and he was an outstanding pediatric urologist as well. And one of the very first cases that we did together, me assisting him, was hypospadias repair. When we'd finished it, he said, okay, well, you can write the operating note and draw a picture of what we did. You can imagine the extraordinary muddle that came from the end of my pencil. When he looked at it, he said, I think I'd better do this, and naturally produced the most completely immaculate series of drawings of Bayer's flaps and the hypospadias repair that he had done. You learn from that, A, pediatric urology is wonderful, B, John Blandy was a wonderful surgeon, both for adults and pediatricians, and C, John Blandy was a very, very good artist. So that was my first introduction. Then I was Sir David Ince-Williams' last senior registrar at the Institute of Urology before he retired, then Philip Ransley's first senior registrar. So I did an extra long time in pediatric urology, and both of those two have been mentors, friends, supporters for all of my life. Sir David Ince-Williams did have an adult practice which he had inherited from Winsbury White. he used that to look after his own child patients when they became grown up. So I took over that practice and with Philip Ransley's support developed it into the adolescent urology clinic.
You did mention there, inextricably linked, the adolescent urology, is the whole question of reconstruction. And the use of various devices for continent diversions, etc., is another thing that is associated with your name. Tell us a little bit about this and also people who influenced you. You didn't mention any Americans or continental Europeans there, but I know that they, in the reconstructive field, have played a big impact.
Plenty of people had been trying to create continent urinary systems, including John Blandy, Mike Handley-Ashkin, Richard Turner Warwick, and I think it'd be true to say with varying levels of success. Niels Koch from Sweden, I think, made the breakthrough of combining a detubularized intestinal reservoir with a nipple valve for self-catheterization. My first adventures in continent reconstruction were entirely influenced by Niels Koch's ideas. There were plenty of other people in the world, including Don Skinner, who did literally thousands of them. I always found it a rather tricky procedure. I think my complication rate was probably unacceptably high. Paul Mitrofanoff described his operation of using a detubularized reservoir and the appendix is a catheterizable stoma. And that was first shown to me by Howard Snyder when he was a visiting fellow in the Institute. And we did the first one in the UK together. That patient is still going strong. I still see her in the clinic. She's now about 26 years after her Mitrofanoff, still catheterizing her appendix and still, lucky her, having had no complications from it. And so Paul Mitrofanoff and Niels Koch were the people whose work I followed in creating these reservoirs.
This has been your life's work, and I know that it's been recognized in many places around the world. Tell us what your greatest honor was in urology.
Well, unquestionably the St. Peter's Medal. The recognition by one's peers is just everything to me. It's lovely getting awards and being invited to give lectures and visiting professorships and so on, but ultimately the environment in which you work and the peer group around you is the group that I am most proud to have impressed sufficiently that they would give me the St. Peter's Medal. Overseas, the membership of the GU surgeons in the United States is a great honor. It is given to some non-Americans. And then, of course, as you know, overseas societies make you honorary members or corresponding members as a special category in recognition of what you've done. It's the people closest to you, both in your life and in your work, that I think are your most critical audience and the ones whose honor you most crave, I think.
Where do we go from here? What's your next big step forward?
Well, at the end of this month, I'm retiring from my chair of adolescent urology at UCL. The Institute of Urology no longer exists, though a lot of us at UCL are survivors from the old institute, and I shall be extremely sad to leave this remaining group. My sentence is over with no remission for good conduct, but I shall continue working at the Marsden in part because I had wanted to continue teaching there and looking after superficial bladder cancer, and in part because of the sad passing of a colleague. Abandoning the Marsden at this particular moment would make life very difficult. for them because there would be not enough people to carry on. So for a year or two, I shall be doing that. Otherwise, I should be riding off into the sunset.
I think I would have to comment that you and I were very lucky in that I think we worked in a period where the Institute of Urology and the St. Peter's Hospitals were really at probably the highest stage of their development. And we were extraordinarily lucky to work with the people that we did.
Oh, absolutely. It was a most remarkable group of people. Equally, I'm sure you'd agree that it wasn't just the surgeons who were absolutely outstanding, but the physicians, the scientists, both research and clinical. One thinks obviously of Roger Pugh in pathology, Alan Rose in biochemistry, Mike Kellett in radiology, an absolutely extraordinary group of people who were individually completely outstanding, but collectively just created an environment that was so wonderful for the care of very, very complex nephrourology patients who really had nowhere else that they could go. And of course, as you point out, the training for those of us who are lucky enough to be there.
Let's move to another area that I know you get a lot of pleasure from, and that is the opera. If I were to say you can go to your favorite opera, and we'll lay it on just for you and Anna, your wife, which one would it be?
Well, there's no doubt at all it would be Traviata. I came to opera, I think, rather late in life. My parents went, but I think they took the very sensible view that the way to get children to enjoy opera was to refuse to take them until they absolutely begged, and the idea that it was definitely for grown-ups only made it an entirely desirable thing to go to. So I did come to it quite late, and the first opera that my wife Anna and I ever went to was Traviata, and I think we've been to practically every production that there has been in London, and it remains absolutely enormous favorite. I've never quite got to like Wagner, though Anna adores Wagner, and she's working on me. I think that I'm going to venture into Wagner, perhaps as a retirement occupation. Of course, you do need an awful lot of time to do Wagner, so perhaps it is better for retirement.
So, any historical heroes that we need to hear about?
If one's thinking of urology ones, I've always rather admired the courage of Dr. Simon. Dr. Simon's paper on ureterosigmoidostomy, which I think is from about 1852, must be one of the most cited papers in the reconstructive world. It was published in the Lancet, and all articles on reconstruction tend to start with Simon's description of the ureterosigmoidostomy. If you actually look at the paper instead of just quoting it, it is the report of one case, early success, and the post-mortem findings. The fact that he managed to produce an entire industry and is still quoted more than 150 years later on one case which subsequently died, I think is grounds for being labelled a hero. More seriously, historical characters. Well, maybe I could cite perhaps one of my own family who I've always tremendously admired, who was called Constance Lytton. She was my great aunt, the daughter of the Viceroy, and we named our daughter after her. She was a militant suffragette. She was sent to prison, but as soon as it was discovered who she was immediately let out and not forcibly fed and so on. So she then provoked a further arrest, having disguised herself as a housemaid and called herself Miss Walton, and so went to prison again, where she was forcibly fed because she didn't say who she really was. She subsequently developed subacute bacterial endocarditis from the infection that she got from inhaling the force feeding, and eventually died from it. One doesn't necessarily think that revolutionaries can be heroes, but They can, and there are occasions when really very vigorous, almost violent protest is required, and she got out of her extremely privileged background and fought for something that she believed in, and which really was a very surprising thing for the daughter of the Viceroy to do. Actually, her brother, my grandfather, is said to have introduced the first bill into Parliament for women's suffrage into the House of Lords. Naturally didn't get through, and that was just before the First World War, but it's nice to feel that there was some revolutionary spirit there.
Well, Christopher, I must say I found that extremely interesting. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on your life and career and other interests.
A pleasure, John. Thank you for asking me.